So, hello everyone, and welcome to this event. Sorry we are closed. Regular migration from Africa to Europe. Although the title doesn't make it explicit, today we're going to be discussing how COVID-19 has impacted on regular migration pathways between Africa and Europe, and within the two regions as well. This is the third and final event of a series that we at ISPI have been hosting every Tuesday. The event is held with the support of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and comes on the wake of the launch this February of a book that I edited for ISPI titled The Future of Migration to Europe. Little did we know just 4 months ago that the future of migration, or indeed the world, would change so much in such a short span of time. In the first event, we're reflecting on the short and long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on migration trends between Europe and Africa. We saw that people are more and more stuck in place, with mobility restrictions having an impact on the lives of those who are already in the move, but also on prospective migrants that are now facing a much harder time moving across borders. Last week, we delved deeper into a specific topic, which is how the global pandemic has been affecting the lives of millions of refugees in Africa and in Europe. We discovered that in Africa, COVID-19 has made people more involuntarily immobile, and that within Europe as well, the rights of refugees and asylum seekers have been shrinking. We also talked about how migration governance mechanisms at the regional and international level, especially those that relate to the European Union and the African Union, appear to be still unfit for purpose when it comes to facilitating coordination among countries, especially in the context of this unprecedented health and economic crisis. Today, as I mentioned, we finally turn to analyzing how COVID-19 has impacted upon regular migration between Africa and Europe. And joining me in this conversation are Vanessa Ley, Regional Manager for West Africa at the Mixed Migration Center, Camille Lecoz, Policy Analyst at the Migration Policy Institute Europe in Brussels, Linger Muslim Mbaye, Senior Research Economist at the African Development Bank in Abidjan, and Jean-Christophe Dumont, Head of International Migration at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. So without further ado, I'd like to go to our first panelist, which is Vanessa, and I would like to ask you, just to, as a starter to open up the debate, you work at the Mixed Migration Center. How is COVID-19 impacting on mobility, and specifically on the people that are on the move or were on the move in key transit hubs in West Africa and the Sahel, and where do you see this going in the next few days and months?
Thanks, Matteo. So yes, I'm speaking on behalf of the Mixed Migration Center, which is a global network carrying data collection and research on mixed migration. And in West Africa, we interview migrants in key transit hubs in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso through a 4MI program, which stands for Mixed Migration Monitoring Mechanism. And as of April of this year, we've been running a survey on impacts of COVID on people on the move in these transit hubs. So I'll share some findings from this survey and our broader research. So firstly, on the impact on mobility, since March this year, we've seen a significant reduction in movements across the regions, with most countries of the regions having closed their borders. It's interesting to see in IOM's flow monitoring points across the region that have reported a decrease in volume of movements of minus 48% between January and April 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. But this suggests that migrant hasn't stopped altogether despite border closures across the regions. And indeed, some migrants continue their journey through the desert towards Libya and Algeria, even though borders have closed. We also see movements between the Sahel to coastal countries such as Burkina Faso to Côte d'Ivoire, including for circular migrations, which shows that borders are still to some extent porous. And as Matteo was saying, what we are seeing in West Africa is also an increase in involuntary mobility in various locations across the region, including in northern Niger, in the Agadez region. According to For my data, among 645 interviewed, 28% reported to have stopped because they are stuck. But interesting to see that only 4% reported to have changed destination. We're also seeing some trends in terms of smuggling dynamics. The use of smugglers has decreased, seems to have decreased in the short term because of border closures. But restrictions may have increased migrants' reliance on smugglers for segments of a journey that they would have usually completed independently within the ECOWAS free movement space to bypass border points. We also see repatriations are blocked, with facilities hosting them that are increasingly saturated, and expulsions continuing from Algeria. Then when we look at the impact on migrants and findings from our data, we see the main impact mentioned by respondents in West Africa are reduced access to work, mentioned by almost 70% of respondents. And this is followed by more worry and stress and reduced availability of basic goods for people on the move. Migrants also report to be in need of extra assistance, with 88% of respondents to our survey indicating only 19% saying they had received additional help in this period. And the greatest gap we're seeing across the free Sahel countries where we conduct data collection is cash assistance and access to work. We've also been seeing anecdotal evidence in our data collection on instances of discrimination and xenophobia. This includes reports that local communities rejecting migrants for fear of contamination, also cases of xenophobic verbal abuse towards migrants. And finally, maybe in terms of future outlook, I think it remains to be seen how the COVID-19 and the resulting economic impacts will affect migration decisions in the future. On the one hand, the need to migrate might increase due to the economic impact of the crisis. GDP growth is expected to fall sharply in 2020, and the reduction in remittances is also impacting many households dependent on these. And on the other hand, fewer people will have the resources to be able to migrate. Often, at least in West Africa, a migration project involves pooling a lot of resources by different family members. And in the next phase of our data collection, we will adjust our survey to get a better insight on how COVID-19 has affected these so-called drivers of migration. And perhaps as a last point on regular migration, this is on the agenda today. So migration management in West Africa has an important focus on fighting irregular migration and facilitating returns, and that's paired with excessively restrictive visa policies. So despite the fact that it's always included in migration agreements like the GCM or the European Agenda on Migration, it's not happening. They're small pilots, but it's hardly scaled up to significant legal migration channels. So the pandemic situation should be, I think, a wake-up call for that Europe is dependent on migrant labor, for example, in agriculture and healthcare. And this was apparent in Italy's law regularizing hundreds of thousands of migrant workers in some sectors. And I can only hope we keep this momentum and do not see rising restrictions on immigration or governments using public health concerns to restrict migration.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was perfectly brief, 5 minutes, but very comprehensive description of what's happening in Africa. And given that you finished by pointing out the fact that Europe has labor shortages in several areas and has had to cope with that, it's great. It serves me to turn to our second speaker, Camille. You at the Migration Policy Institute Europe have been analyzing what's been happening with COVID-19 in terms of regular migration and pathways, legal pathways to get safely to Europe, both for labor and possibly even for those needing labor migrants and those needing protection. But I would like to ask what has been happening in Europe, what were the pathways beforehand, and how has COVID-19 impacted upon them?
Thank you, Matteo, for the invitation, and thank you for this introduction. So as you mentioned, I will now shift the focus to Europe and labor migration policies. And I will say a few words about what legal pathways were available for workers seeking to migrate legally from Africa to Europe for work purposes, even though there are other legal pathways, as you mentioned, that have to do more with humanitarian protection, with resettlement, and for instance, in Italy with the humanitarian corridors. So as we mentioned, I mean, since 2015 and 16 and the migrant and refugee crisis, there have been many discussions on the creation of legal pathways to show goodwill with partner countries, but also to curb irregular migration. And in relation to Africa, there was this commitment made by European leaders at the Valletta Summit in November 2015. However, policy initiatives to expand these legal pathways for work and training have remained pretty limited, especially in recent years, and they've remained very much under the realm of EU member states. The EU has had only a limited role in this area. At the same time, it should be said that most EU member states have legal channels for work and training, including for low and middle skilled workers. And they all have their own national mechanism with benefits and limitation, with the objective of addressing labor market needs, but also avoiding competition with the domestic workforce and lowering labor market standards. Sweden, for instance, has one of the most liberal approaches, mainly rely on employer sponsorship, and in comparison, government in countries like Germany, Italy, France have more hands-on approach, and they rely on a combination of tools, shortage occupation list and labor market tests in France, quota in Italy, in order to define the volume and the profile of labor migrants. A number of European countries also have bilateral agreement with third countries. For instance, Germany has developed a close cooperation with Western Balkan states, and countries like France, Italy, Spain have bilateral agreement with African countries. These allow them to meet labor market needs, but also think to incentivize migration management, cooperation, including on returns. That's a very sensitive topic. But I'd now like to turn to spend a few minutes on discussing the impact of COVID-19 on these legal pathways, that exist. Because beyond, the pandemic has now more or less put labor migration on hold, with European countries closing their borders and the processing of visa. And beyond this almost operational aspect, labor migration is also going to be affected by the economic crisis resulting from COVID. Many people have now lost their job, including migrants already in Europe. And while countries are starting to reopen across Europe, it remains to be seen what sector will quickly recover and which one, for example, in the tourist industry that have historically relied on foreign worker may need more time to be back to full speed. In other words, it's very possible, very likely that the previous assessments of the needs of the European economy will look very different than what they look like at the beginning of the year. And now, the period has also shown, as Vanessa mentioned, that there's still pressing labor shortages in sectors like agriculture. And I can say maybe a few words later on what has happened with seasonal worker program. But for now, European and African countries may need to work together to allow for labor migrants to travel again. And this implies to look at how to decrease the risk of spreading the virus while traveling, what measures should be set up in countries of origin in terms of testing before departure, but also health measures in airports, and then what to do upon arrival. So some countries have explored the option of systematic testing. Others, like Canada or Portugal, have looked into an imposed quarantine for newcomers. And there are also questions on how to make this measure effective, how to monitor that these measures are in place, in countries of origin, which imply a certain level of trust between partner countries. And it also raised a question of whether European countries could support a few of their key partners in setting up these measures for states that may not have the resources to invest immediately in this area, while they have so many other pressing priorities. So this situation may also lead to new travel bubbles or new migration corridors if countries start recruiting workers from origin country when the number of cases are low, This may also raise new question in terms of what, the capacity of recruitment for employers who maybe are not used to work in a certain country, and will now have to deploy recruitment processes in country where it may be difficult to operate due to the pandemic. So these are all the questions to keep in mind. And I think you've also discussed in your first meeting, what counts as essential worker and what is the occupation that European states are going to need foreign worker for. Maybe a word of conclusion. So I think what we've seen is government, in the current economic context, government will have to be strategic about seeking to recruit foreign workers. And they, in the short term at least, may try to incentivize employers to recruit local workers. And this is something we've seen in the agriculture sector at the beginning of the pandemic. Another thing to keep in mind is that communication about investing in this migration channel will need to be carefully managed, as this is likely to remain a sensitive topic for many public opinion in Europe in time of an economic crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Camille. That's again, as comprehensive as it could be. Actually, to point out a paradox, it's interesting as mobility has been reduced, actually come to a stop for labor migration to Europe. It's interesting how we have maybe many governments in Europe have realized that they had pool of a pool from which to draw on, which was undocumented workers, and they tried many things to regularize them. But still, there's a lot to say on whether this kind of rebalancing of this system is going to be sustainable in the long term, and maybe also what will be the effect on African countries. And so let me turn to Linger, who is a senior economist at the African Development Bank, and so who better than her to tell us about what could the knock-on effects of all this be on the persons who are living in Africa and for African governments in terms of remittances and everything else. So how is, let's say, involuntary mobility and this, this period of lower mobility going to impact on African countries and people? Linger, unmute yourself.
Yes, it's fine now. Can you hear me? Yeah,
sure,
thank
yes.
you very much. So in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on migration and remittances in Africa, I would just start with this latest figures by the Africa CDC that says that in addition to basically the 43 countries that are under full border closure, you have a nighttime curfew that has also been activated across 35 countries. So this has huge impact both in terms of internal migration. I think Vanessa has explained this very well earlier on. What we need to understand is that these internal or sub-regional migration represent around 80% of immigrant stock in Africa. So these internal migrants they represent about 2.5 times that of international migrants. So there is really a huge issue for labor mobility. And migrant workers, in particular those in low skills jobs, in tourism and services, basically all the sectors that are heavily affected by the pandemic, or those who are even in part-time jobs, are particularly the ones who are suffering from the lockdown and quarantine measures. And they are particularly vulnerable as well because they were already in low-paid jobs, and this situation could just push them into poverty. And this also have consequences in terms of remittances. And I would like also to maybe build on what Vanessa said earlier on the impact of restrictions, because it also means that there are many issues and difficulties to channel agricultural production from markets to urban centers, which represent an additional loss of earnings for many migrants. So if we look at the latest figures from the World Bank, we know that already in 2020, remittance flows to low and middle income countries are expected to drop by 20%. And Sub-Saharan Africa is really among the regions that would suffer the most. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, this is estimated at -23%. basically. So the reduction in remittances is due to many things: the job losses, the reductions of salaries, the increase of cost as well, related to healthcare for migrants. And this really will have consequences at the macro level and at a micro level. At a macro level, remittances for many African countries are the primary source of external funding. And they really represent an important part of countries' income. And you have many countries that, where remittances represent more than 10% of their GDP, Cabo Verde, Comoros, Senegal, Liberia. So basically, this decrease in remittance flow would have huge impact on national budget, and this would even reduce even more countries' fiscal space. And this impact is all the more, I would say, important and can be considered as a very important adverse shocks, because you also have other external funding, such as the FDI, that are also decreasing. And we shouldn't be forgetting that this is happening in a context before the pandemic, where you had countries with already high level of debt and tight fiscal policy. So tight fiscal space, sorry. At a micro level, remittance represent a major source of income, if not the only source of income for many households across the continent. So this income shock basically resulting from the decrease in remittances would mean for those households less investment in human capital in terms of education and health. So for migrants, families that belong to the middle income distribution, this could push them into chronic poverty. And above all, if this household basically lack the required income to be able to revert to their previous situation before the pandemic. And for those who are already in vulnerable situation, this could just push them into a poverty trap. So this type of important adverse shock can have both short-term impact now, but also long-term impact with regard to future labor market outcomes, for example, or future health outcomes. And that really drives me to talk about the issue of resilience. So usually, normally in basic migration theory, migration is used as a diversification of risk mechanism to diversify risk. And the problem is that here we are in an extraordinary situation where both remittance receivers and senders are facing the same shock at the same time. And this really put an additional burden, both on migrants and their families that are left behind, but also this kind of threaten their capacity to cope with the shock and to build resilience for the future. And that maybe will be my final point, will lead me really to the issue of, okay, what do we do now going forward, already talking about the post-COVID era in terms of policy? How do we help households and migrants themselves build resilience and deal with cope with fragility issue and the type of shocks that we are facing now? So directly related to the COVID-19, the bank, the AFDB, has put in place a 10 billion USD response facility to directly help government. I talked about the impact of remittances on fiscal space. So this is really to help them basically in this challenging time deal with this tight fiscal space due to the shock, but also helping the private sector. More generally, really the work we do here at the AFDB really aim to address the drivers of fragility in general and help countries really build resilience, because we know that the drivers of fragility are also the same drivers are the one of migration. And my last point will be related to the issue of regional integration, which is one of the top priority of the AFDB. Regional integration will really help foster labor mobility. And more than ever, labor mobility would be a tool to help households deal with the adverse consequences of shocks and will be used as a risk diversification. So we need to take advantage of the African continental free trade area. But more importantly, countries need to really start implementing these labor mobility policies and free movement policies, because we know that we have those tools, we know that those policies are there, but they are sometimes even ratified, but they are not effectively implemented. And we've shown in the work of the bank in the African Economic Outlook 2018, we clearly show that if you have regional economic community, for example, where you have a free movement of protocol, but countries do not ratify those protocols, do not implement them, it doesn't have any effect on labor mobility. However, as soon as countries start implementing those protocols, you have a jump basically in labor mobility within the region. So really, I think that we do have the tools now. It's just a matter of making them effective and implementing them going forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Inga. This was very important to say. In the end, we do have the policy tools. Sometimes we do not implement them, and it's interesting that possibly sometimes it's the same that happens in Africa. It's the same that happens in Europe, especially in times in which mobility restrictions were justified, at least partly, and possibly even more so when the first wave hit us. So let me turn back to Jean-Christophe, the head of migration at the OECD, and I would like to ask you. We are going back to Europe to close this first round, and Camille Lacoste told us about how regular migration into Europe works, how countries are adapting to this new reality of coping with the global pandemic and different waves and then the reopenings. And I know that the OECD recently published a report titled Managing International Migration Under COVID-19. So can you share some insights from that publication, and where do you see this going, and maybe some mid to long-term trends that you see these changes are doing for the European countries?
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for the invitation. Let me start by saying maybe that it's fair to say that this period can be seen as a stress test for the Euro-African relationship on migration, as well as some other aspect as well. When you count the number of people born in Africa living in the OECD, the total number is about 12 million, which is 11% of all immigrants in the OECD. I'm speaking in terms of stock here. 3.7 million are living in France. About half of the 12 million are living in Spain, Italy, or France. 3 countries which have been mostly affected by the COVID recently. But there is another 2 million in the US and 1.2 million in the UK. 3/4 of all African migrants to the OECD are basically in these 5 countries which have been severely affected, or where policy measures will be the most severe. So I think it's fair to say that there was little appetite, despite the Valletta summit, for increasing migration from Africa to Europe through legal pathways before the COVID. Let's face it. I fear that in the current context, the impact will be quite large. Indeed, travel bans have been put in place, resettlement is on hold, and nobody knows when resettlement will resume to its normal speed, if it does at any time. Legal pathways have been affected, yes, by the economy. I can come back to that, but we just heard the announcement from the US today that they will extend the ban for green cards and also add new restriction on temporary visas, notably H-1B, H-2A, H visa, G1 visas. So all series of very important legal pathways for the US. So we also know that, for example, international students will be severely affected by the current situation and travel restriction, and that applies obviously to African migrants who generally have to face additional hurdles to reach out to the international study programs abroad. In parallel, it's also fair to say, as you said, Matteo, that a number of destination countries, mostly in Europe, have taken ever blanket relief measures to enable people to stay, or have at least tolerated people who are coming to an end of a visa, if not like Portugal, temporarily regularized people as a result of COVID-19. So indeed, countries are, I think, starting to understand that there is a stock of people and that these people will have very difficult time going back to their country of origin, and something needs to be done about these people. But I'm saying are starting to think about, because only one country, seriously, Italy, has taken measures, and we'll have to see to which extent this regularization program really covers the hundreds of thousands that the Italian government is targeting, or whether, you know, the condition for accessing to this regularization will be such that only maybe fewer people will have access. But only Italy so far has taken long-term measures, or is in this long-term vision of enabling people to stay. If you look at the medium-term forecasts, indeed, I think the economy is severely affected in many countries, notably in the three countries I've just mentioned, France, Italy, and Spain, where unemployment rate has increased. I mean, we have few figures here and there. In the US, we've seen, for example, that unemployment rate of immigrants altogether, not specifically African immigrants, have increased by 14 percentage points. It was lower than native born before the COVID. It's now higher. In Germany, immigrants have been 7 times more affected by unemployment than native born. We have few figures here and there, and it shows the same results everywhere, despite the partial unemployment schemes which have been applied, notably in most European countries. Immigrants are more affected, partly because they have different type of contracts. Most of them have temporary contracts, which are the first to be cut and not renewed during this time. So it's no surprise that immigrants are more affected. And I don't have figures specifically on African migrants, but I wouldn't be surprised that among migrants they are even more affected. What we may see in Europe, which would add to that difficult times, is also kind of a substitution, and we are seeing that right now, between EU migrants and third country nationals. Why? Because mobility has been, let's say, reinstalled in the EU context before, and because this crisis is affecting everybody. So there are people ready to move on and to take some of the jobs. For example, that let's say African migrant women were taking in Spain, picking strawberry and other fruits. The same in Sweden. It was mentioned Sweden used to have a lot of Thai migrants to pick berries. Thai government doesn't allow these people to leave the country. And so at the end of the day, most likely it's going to be EU migrants taking over. Whether that's going to have a long-lasting effect or not, it's hard to know. But certainly this substitution effect, and you can see Greece is putting in place a special program with Albania for seasonal agricultural work, and Italy is also turning to its traditional countries of origin nearby. So I think it's fair to say that in addition to the shock, in addition to the difficulty to come in the first place, some of these effects might just make the situation more difficult for African migrants. But I think what really worries me is, as it was said by the previous speaker, the situation in countries of origin is not good. Remittances will decline. I think the 20% estimate from the World Bank is really on the low side. I wouldn't be surprised that at the end you have a double that figure in terms of reducing remittances. In addition to that, there is another shock that is being more or less unnoticed, but that will just increase the effect on migration, which is the oil shock price. So the reduction of the oil price, which is affecting countries like Algeria, obviously like Nigeria, and a number of African oil-producing countries, where obviously the revenues that this country can get out of migration, but also the opportunity that some of this country may get to go abroad, to work in the Gulf or somewhere else will just be decreased. So that affects not only Africa, but maybe some Asian country. And the accumulation of all these things, I think, creates a situation where if we don't do anything, the gap between the aspiration for migration, which are already very high, Gallup survey before the crisis in Africa, in Western Africa, was showing that 1 in 2 15 to 24 years old person was looking for opportunities to migrate. Obviously, not everybody migrate among these people, but this intention to migrate has probably increased further, and the opportunities, as I said, has decreased in the meantime. This gap is really risky at a time where the public opinion in destination country is hypersensitive to migration issue. So certainly, as I started saying, this is a stress test. I think this is a stress test from an holistic approach to this OECD, Africa, EU, Africa relationship, going much beyond migration, on trade, on humanitarian support, on innovation, joint projects, a number of actions that are needed to create a common future rather than to create more division and a more decisive society. Thank you very much.
So, Jean-Christophe, I think these latest points are the most important ones. So, this is a stress test for everyone, for Africa, but also for Europe possibly, because as you said, the enlarging, widening gap between regular migration pathways that are shrinking and migration aspirations that continue to increase or might be on the rise is going to be maybe even worrisome. So let me turn to Vanessa again and ask her, I don't know if you did some research outside the region, but even in the Sahel region, what do you see happening for the people on the move and maybe those who cannot move today? Do you see people still willing to leave and not being able to do so? Also within the context of these, in the end, porous borders, right? You have a lot of countries with many restrictions in place, but still people can, in some ways, move around within the region. And finally, I don't know whether you did something on this, but in the end, irregular migration to Italy is a bit up compared to last year. It's very low, very, very low, but it's still a bit up. And some of the speculations are, for instance, that people in Tunisia are much worse off today, this year, than last year, and are willing to leave with large numbers. So there is a gap between aspirations and possibilities to reach Europe. Do you think that irregular migration will increase, or what do you see happening?
Thanks, Matteo. So yes, I think so. We interview migrants in West Africa on a continuous basis through our for my program, and one of the key findings we see continuously is that when we ask about motivations for migration, a majority say they are migrating for economic opportunity, socioeconomic reasons, along with other reasons, and that can also be multiple reasons. But also a strong factor for migration is also cultural, and for young West Africans, it's also a rite of passage. And we're already seeing as despite border restrictions, some movements, despite the border being closed in northern Niger, that migrants are still aspiring to go to Libya and Algeria, even though the possibilities are much more restricted. And so I'd say in terms of aspirations, I don't see that reducing. In fact, when we ask migrants whether their plans have changed as a due to COVID. Many say they are not changing their destination, that they are staying put for a while as waiting for the borders to open or to find passage. And there's also the shame to returning. There's so much investment that's been, for those that have already started the journey, a shame in returning. So yes, I would think that these aspirations would not change with that, but that the opportunities to migrate might become even more difficult.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Yes, I think that we will have a lot to monitor in the next months and years to see whether, again, flows to Europe become more irregular than regular, and we'll see where this leads us to for the next few months and years. Personally, I think actually that these might be, temporary in a sense, that COVID will in the end disappear. Let's hope sooner than later, but its effects will be, felt over a couple of years, and we'll see the trends going a bit up, at least if in Libya the situation remains as chaotic as it's been until at least a few weeks ago. So turning to Camille, let me again go back to Europe, because again, we said we've been talking about again this widening gap between the aspirations of people to move and the possibilities to do so. And so European countries, as you said, and as Jean-Christophe said, have turned towards dealing with seasonal workers and the labor shortages that have come about with migration, with mobility restrictions. So where do you see this? I mean, what has been happening, and where do you see this going in terms of both managing seasonal workers and maybe regularizing part of the undocumented migrants here? And I don't know whether you expect something in terms of substitution. Do you think that the regularization of those here will then maybe make European countries less prone to hiring people from abroad?
Thank you, Matteo. I think, there's a lot has changed, like in the current season, and I think it's still too early to say whether these changes are going to be long lasting. I think there's also been this myth that all these workers could be replaced by people who were available because they were not working. And I think in the case of a country like France, we've seen very quickly that was not the case, that all the people that initially expressed enthusiasm for going to the field and working in the farms, like this has not really lasted very long. I think it has also come with this, with maybe this representation that these jobs are don't require skills, whereas I think, as we've seen, it's like they actually require some specific skills. I think, there's been this question, it's been a pressing question for European countries, especially because countries like, as Jean-Christophe mentioned, countries like Spain, Italy, France rely largely on foreign workers, and they've had this program for a long time. They used farmers in this region, in France, in Spain. They used to work with, this region in Morocco, in Tunisia. These pathways work pretty well, considering other pathway and all of the challenges that I think are faced for other legal migration pathways. Taking again the example of France. And so countries have reacted in three main ways so far. Some, as I've mentioned, have redeployed residents to try to take on this job, having all this public campaign encouraging people to take these jobs. I think this has had mixed effect. They've also expanded the stay for foreign seasonal workers who were already present in the country. So this has been the case, for example, in France for some, seasonal worker for some countries. I think there's been some frustration on the fact that sometimes the extension has not been as long as some farmers or some employers would have liked it to be. And in some countries, they've issued exemption. And so here you've seen, exemption being made for seasonal worker from certain countries. But this again was raising question in terms of how do you do screening? How do you ensure that people who return to their home countries return in a way that, they don't contribute to spread the disease in their origin countries? And then I think there's also this question on how do you ensure health and safety measures in this work environment. And I think we've seen cases in the past few weeks in Germany with outbreak of COVID-19, and I think a concern that, the necessary measure had not been enforced. So that's for what has happened. I think in terms of the substitution effect, it will depend on the country. I'm a bit skeptical that if possible, I think a lot of employers are going to be keen on returning to a system that was working well for them. Now, as I think some people are saying the effect of the pandemic are going to be for the next few years, there's going to have to be, I think, new recruitment channel that will need to be established. And I think this is going to require a level of investment, and will have to be seen like who is ready to make this investment.
Thanks a lot, Camille. I guess that now we can then turn to Africa again, because again within this context of aspirations remaining wide and regular migration becoming much harder to do, as we talked about, and as Jean-Christophe was estimating, the 20% figure of remittances being cut that Julian was talking about might be even larger than that. So what do you expect? And you talked about the African Development Bank and how you try to build resilience and work on managing the risk. And surely migration is a way to manage risks for households and individuals. So what do you think that is going to happen? But also, what could both the African Development Bank and maybe the African Union and African countries, and possibly even the EU countries, do to help, let's say, manage this period of high uncertainty in terms of migration? Do you have any guidance on that, or what are you doing in the African Development Bank in order to address this challenge?
Thank you, Matteo. Yes, I think it's very difficult to predict anything, because we just, for the simple reason that it will end for sure, but we don't know when, right? So in the meantime, we have to kind of deal with it and find the solutions that we can find. So really, I start to mentioning, all the policy options, including, having labor mobility as a way to deal with risk, and really facilitating labor mobility within Africa, from Africa to Europe as well, the regular channels, of course, because now we are in a time where, it will be more and more increasingly difficult to regularly migrate for issues of funding, for, all the issues we've discussed in the first part of the roundtable. But I also think that really dealing with the impact of COVID has to be put in a broader perspective, right? Because, COVID is affecting our economies, but there were a lot of dysfunctionality before COVID happened. And COVID the pandemic would likely increase those dysfunctionalities. And so there is the issue of regional integration. Progress has been made, but still, we still need to work on it. Also, in terms of the work we're doing here at the bank, one of the main area the bank is really active is basically giving options to young people in particular, through job creation, through entrepreneurship in sectors like the agriculture or ICT. And the rationale behind is that, okay, migration in itself is not a bad thing. We've talked about the remittances and how important they are for many countries and households. However, when migration becomes the only option available for people, and that would lead to risky behavior such as irregular migration, then we start all having issues, African countries, but also European countries. So really, one of the area where the AFDB is really insisting on is really giving those options for young people to be able at least to have to choose, have the opportunity to have those decent jobs in their origin countries, those giving them the opportunity to engage into entrepreneurship, work into the agricultural sector, into the business of agriculture, not just being a farmer, but really having it as a business that can be productive. And really, I think this was important before the pandemic, but it is all the more important now that we have to face this risk and these shocks that really would have a major economic impact in African economies. Why? Because they were kind of, I would say, already dealing with many economic issues. And, you know, this period of lockdown, I'm not even talking about the health impact. So far, I mean, we don't know how the situation will evolve, but so far Africa has been less affected than other regions, but the social economic impact would be really huge. And we already start feeling it. We have inflation, for example, that has raised in many countries, and we shouldn't also, again, not underestimate the impact of remittances, even remittances happening within countries. Sometimes really those migrants transferred, they are either a huge part of household income or the only income actually that household would receive. So yeah, so I think that we need really to, when we talk about labor mobility and migration and the impact of COVID on those aspects, look at a broader perspective in terms of how we make economies more resilient to shocks, not only the COVID-19 shocks. Now we have, for example, in East Africa, the locust 19, for example, in addition to the COVID-19, will tend to have more and more climate-related shocks, for example. So really, we should take this as a kind of maybe learning lesson to see how we can fix issues that we have to fix and move forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot for sharing the view, your view, and possibly also from the African Development Bank on how to improve resilience at this time. You know, very, very challenging times, not only for COVID-19, but as I said, you know, climate change is maybe going to be even more long-term and more impactful for some countries in the households. So turning and maybe drawing to going towards the closure with Jean-Christophe Dumont, I would like to ask him maybe again from an organizational perspective, from the OECD, is there something that you want to say to governments, to European governments, to advanced countries governments, in terms of guidance and best practices and policies on how to, you know, how to face these challenging times and how to go, you know, how to deal with migration in different times, but you know, in order to not to, you know, to balance risks and opportunities.
Well, building on what has just been said, I think increasing the resilience of let's say management systems in general, and then migration in particular, is certainly important. I mean, improving preparedness, we've seen that, and we've sent that message to countries in the context of the 2015-16 migration crisis. I think here again, EU countries and OECD countries have been caught off guard. It was obviously very difficult to anticipate really, but what we've seen is very little coordination in this context, and I'm not sure that countries have really learned the lessons from the previous crises, even if they were of a different kind. I mean, certainly, if you should take all the issues one by one, but resettlement is a key tool in terms of responsibility sharing, and provides a legal pathway that probably may contribute, let's say, may contribute to reduce the number of people who are risking their life on boats with smugglers. If resettlement would be closed for a long time, beyond a few months, if country would kind of challenge their commitment on resettlement, I think that would have additional effects to the one you can expect from the current circumstances. So here, typically, a coordinated and quick resume to the normal processing should be envisaged. I think there are questions which are a bit more strategic, longer term. We talk a lot about agriculture. At the end of the day, this is not a lot of people for for most countries, seasonal agricultural workers are only a small portion of all migrants in most countries, with some exceptions. Here, I think that there is certainly, I mean, and the sort of decisions that Italy has taken recently should be highlighted, because it's forward-looking, it's trying to anticipate, to acknowledge that the needs will remain, and that people who are here are probably the best place to take this work. May it be in domestic sector or hospitality or agriculture. But some other countries are not, anticipating that, and they will wake up with a large stock of undocumented migrants and difficult times to reach the consensus with their public opinion to solve that problem. And obviously, we know the return will not be the solution, because also of the difficulty to return people, not only now, but also in the months to come. So this capacity to anticipate what will come next and to coordinate action, notably at EU level, I think is critical. More broadly, I think there is a need to go beyond a little bit the rhetoric and acknowledge that migration is part of our economies and societies, and that there is no good and bad policies, but there is good and bad ways to manage migration. So we need to make sure that there is, if there is one lesson that we can draw from the COVID episode, and I will stop there, it's really that the closure of border is not an option. We realize that because families are living both sides of the borders, because there are skill needs, because there are humanitarian needs, and so closing the border is not the solution. So I think it's really a time to acknowledge that yes, we need migration policies, we need well-designed migration policy fitted to a purpose and needs. And here, I guess there is still a lot to do in many countries.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Christophe. I'd love to close on this, because this was, almost on a positive note, at least. There is a lot to do, but let's do it. Maybe I can take, given that we still have 4 minutes, I can take one question from the public. And so before closing, I'd like to go back to Linguère. So Christian van Buiten was asking, at the AFDB, when looking at the creation of job opportunities for young people, are there any specific reflections ongoing on how to support low-skilled young people to access the formal labor market? I know it's a very broad question. It's not necessarily related to migrants, but if you want to answer, I'll give you 2 minutes for that, and then we will draw to a close.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, actually, we do have several programs, and actually one big initiative, which is the Job for Youth in Africa, which really aim to create 25 million jobs in 10 years and equip 50 million young people in good jobs, because the issue we have in Africa is that actually unemployment rates are quite low, but underemployment is extremely high. So most of the people work in the informal sector, and that means also vulnerable jobs, vulnerable jobs, and we're linking it to the issue of migration. Those are the people that are working part-time, that have this low salary, and that are basically not able to cope with any type of shock. So we have these programs that really want to equip those young people with the right skills, also helping them with entrepreneurship in the area of agriculture and ICT. I mentioned this before. And really, again, the aim here really is building skills, education and training as well, because we have also training gap. And also, it's very ambitious, right? It's very ambitious, but I think, as Jean-Christophe says, we need the right policies, and right policies have to be bold to make any changes, right? So, so we really do have those programs that support the young people. We also have this, I mentioned it earlier, but just to make the link with the migration issue, the regional integration issue, which is one of our really top priorities. because I mean, not only in Africa, everywhere basically, we all agree that it's important that we have you know, goods and services being exchanged, and there is kind of less issues when it comes to trade, but we tend to forget that goods and services are moved by people. So this is extremely important. And we talked about issues in terms of migration from Africa to Europe, but we also do have lots of issues within Africa in terms of labor mobility, going from one country to another. And we shouldn't be forgetting that this is a huge part of the migration happening from Africa, and represent a large part of income and resources for many people. Yeah, wanted to be brief, so.
Thanks. No, thanks a lot. It's been very important to say this, and so I would like to thank all the speakers. And in reflecting and in closing down, drawing this to close, I just wanted to say, you know, we titled this panel "Sorry We Are Close," and as we reflected on this, you know, as if we stay close too much, then we go out of business, and we have seen this, you know, throughout the economy. So the need, I mean, I think that from all the interventions, there is, it comes out the need to plan ahead. So we now know we are in this situation. We have faced the first wave of this crisis. We're going out from this crisis, and we're trying to manage it and navigating turbulent times. We know we have to navigate turbulent times. We have to do this for ourselves and for the whole world. So I think that all these contributions and these exhortations to plan ahead, to move ahead and plan ahead, are really relevant. And so I thank all the four panelists and speakers, and I thank all of you for having stayed with us until the end. And so till next time, thanks to you, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.